This podcast is made possible through listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina.
And the Florence County Museum, announcing Fighters for Freedom, William H. Johnson Picturing Justice, organized by the Smithsonian American Art Museum with support from Art Bridges. Johnson's evocative work is on view now through August 10th. FlocoMuseum.org.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast about South Carolina culture and history, with a nod to all things Southern. After 2 decades of research and investigation, the South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust, in collaboration with the South Carolina American Revolution Sestercentennial Commission, has unveiled the first volume of the Francis Marion Papers, a project that holds the potential to reshape our understanding of one of the American Revolution's most heroic figures.
The papers consist of more than 600 historical documents, including letters written both to and from Marion. These materials, discovered in archives across the country, including Harvard University and the University of Michigan, have been carefully compiled and annotated. The first volume was released on February 27th, the anniversary of Marion's death.
Today, we'll be talking about how the Francis Marion Papers project came about its historical significance, and about the man himself. Our guests are Molly Fortune, CEO of the South Carolina American Revolution Sestercentennial Commission, Rick Wise, Director of the South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust, and co-editor of the project, Ben Rubin. Molly Fortune, it's great to have you with us today, and Rick Wise in the studio, and Ben Rubin from New Jersey. Welcome.
Thanks. Good morning.
All right, Rick, you and I were chatting before we went on the air, and everybody's impression of Francis Marion comes from Leslie Nielsen in the 1950s. I was going to say sitcom.
Well, it was a series on the Walt Disney program, which was probably Wonderful World of Disney at that point.
I think it was
absolutely.
Sunday nights.
Yeah.
And I watched it as a young boy.
Well, so did I. But you know what is interesting is why Walt Disney picked Francis Marion. At that time, he is a forgotten hero of the American Revolution. That wasn't true of the world right after the American Revolution. In fact, really, the 2 great heroes of the Revolution to Americans in the early 19th century were George Washington and Francis Marion.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the number of cities that were named, Marion was only second to Washington for the number of cities, counties, and other establishments named for them after the war.
And even New England poets wrote a song about Francis Marion.
Sure did.
I mean, it's incredible. And then he disappeared from the narrative until Walt Disney and Leslie Nielsen revived it.
Do we know why he disappeared from the narrative? Was it because who was writing the textbooks?
Well, I think, I'm not sure, that's part of it, but I really think he died relatively young, and he had no children. He had descendants.
Didn't write his own biography.
He didn't write his own biography.
He did not have the same PR agent that Paul Revere had.
Oh,
Exactly.
oh. Molly, you're getting into my favorite hobby horse here because, Jane Black Thomas up in Spartan District.
100%.
Explain Jane Black Thomas.
Jane Black Thomas, she was the wife of the commander of the Spartan Regiment. He was captured by the British. He was imprisoned at Star Fort in Greenwood, present-day Greenwood, and he was ill. So in those days, if somebody got sick, you weren't taken care of by your captors. So she got word. She went down to help take care of him, and she overheard some British officers' wives talking about a raid. They were going to surprise the Spartan Regiment. Well, this woman who was over 60, and being over 60, I'm kind of sensitive to that. But in those days, that was pretty old. She steals a horse, rides bareback almost 65 or 70 miles to present-day Spartanburg County area to warn the Spartan Regiment, which then ambushes the British at the First Battle of Thickety Fort.
Yep.
But we digress.
We do. It's easy. It's easy to digress.
It's easy to digress about the American Revolution, especially in the South and about South Carolina, because that has been not the subject of many histories over the last 150 years. Rick, we did digress, as Henry Lumpkin would have said, or Owen Conley would actually have said, old history professors at the University of South Carolina. Let's get back to Leslie Nielsen and Francis Marion and what Francis Marion looked like, because Nielsen's a pretty normal-sized guy.
Yeah, most of the descriptions say that Marion, William Dobin James said that he was below medium height. Below medium height meant short. And so if about 5'6", 5'7" was the average height at that time, probably put him somewhere around 5'2", 5'3", we're thinking. Leslie Nielsen, if they wanted to have portrayed probably Thomas Sumter, Nielsen would have been a good choice. I think Sumter was sort of like the high school quarterback.
Yeah.
In Marion's case, I like to envision him sort of as a shorter Jamie Farr, Klinger from MASH. That type complexion, a hook nose, those sort of things that are described about him, and only about 130 pounds.
Yeah, and he was a Huguenot.
Yes, he was.
And Henry Lawrence, who was also a Huguenot, described him as having a darker complexion than most Huguenots in South Carolina. Of course, they came from southern France, so they were darker. So everything from skin tone to height to weight, Leslie Nielsen was not Francis Marion.
Not at all.
No.
And one of the things we did, and we've done some illustrations, of course, for Liberty Trail. And one of the things we did was a portrait of Francis Marion. And, of course, no one knows what he really looked like because he had no sitting portraits ever done. And so one of the things I tried to help our artist, Dale Watson, who's over in Mount Pleasant, tried to help him figure out what Marion would have looked like. And so what I did is I wanted to look for someone who was of French Huguenot descent, someone who was about 50 years old, and someone who was noted for being a hard disciplinarian, because Marion definitely was a hard disciplinarian. Yeah. And what I found was an image of a gentleman that most people will know. The person that met all the description to include that dark complexion and dark eyes was General Claire Chennault, commander of the Flying Tigers in World War II.
Okay. Ancestry certainly works on that.
Absolutely.
Okay. And he also, we might say, another person who was supposed to be Francis Marion, although called somebody else, was in The Patriot. That whole character.
You're talking about Mel Gibson.
We're talking about Mel Gibson.
Well, that's a darn good-looking Francis Marion.
A darn good-looking Francis Marion with a lot of children he never had. And
well, Dr. Edgar, speaking of The Patriot, excellent movie, about 279 things historically inaccurate about the movie itself, but I think it gets the point across, and particularly about the backcountry and the Civil War that was taking place in the backcountry.
There are a couple of things that it gets right. Why were people fighting? Mm-hmm. Okay, you've got the son of the Marion character, Mel Gibson's son, who signs up to fight for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Declaration of Independence. He's a patriot. That motivates him. His daddy finally goes to war only after the British invade, kill his children, burn his house. And so you've got two reasons in South Carolina why people fought. General Williams from 96 had been in uniform from day one and died at Kings Mountain. Mm-hmm. Okay? But then there were others. Thomas Sumter, he was back home, and he only got back into the fight because they burned his property and brutalized his wife.
Well, Pickens is the same way.
Yeah.
I was going to say, Andrew Pickens.
Yeah.
The quintessential story of that.
And I never did see, I have to say, the Disney production. Charles, who is our former chairman, who fortunately passed away of cancer a year ago, who's the brainchild behind this project, always said, you cannot go see this. You cannot go see this because it'll taint you. It'll taint you. And so now I feel like I can probably go and watch the Disney-ness, but I always felt like while he was alive, he'd find out and hunt me down.
Is it still available?
It is, actually.
Oh, yes.
I watched it on YouTube when I first got this job. The entire series is on YouTube.
Let's get to the papers of Francis Marion. As a historian, there have been a number of writing projects, papers projects published in South Carolina, sponsored by the National Archives, and in terms of the Revolution, the most important being the papers of Henry Lawrence. But what you were starting with was a huge collection physically of the papers located at the South Carolina Historical Society. Now, there is no major collection of Francis Marion papers. So how did all of this begin?
Well, from my perspective on the administrative side, it really was a brainchild between Charles Baxley, our former chairman of the SC 250, and Dave Nealon, who they had conversed for over 20 years about the fact that nothing was really all together. And this was a definitive figure in the United States, and we needed to be able to really study his work and his personality and what made him tick and why he joined the partisan fight. So Dave Nealon collected as many as he could.
Art, explain who Dave Nealon was.
Dave Nealon is still living. He lives in Pennsylvania. He is a fabulous Rev War aficionado, and he simply had a passion, and Rick, you can, and Ben, you guys can jump in here too, that just fell in love with Francis Marion and spent a long time, close to 20 years, isn't that what it was? Just collecting and putting it all together.
Yeah, the amazing thing is we have mentioned the Disney the presentation of Francis Marion, and that's what inspired Dave Nealon. He was from Pennsylvania. Yep. He came down to visit relatives in Florence, South Carolina. They told him all about the swamp fox, and he went over and bought a book in Georgetown when they visited there on the Revolutionary War Trail. And from about 2006 to 2013 or so, Dave went out and found all these letters. He found them in auction sites. He found them at different archives, private collections. And to his knowledge, at least last time I talked to him, there is only one letter he knows that he doesn't have. It belonged to a dentist in California, and the dentist couldn't figure out where the box was that had the letter. But the other extant letters he thinks he has.
So he physically has collected these, or copies of them?
Mostly copies, and then, of course, he transcribed them.
It's interesting because I know there are a lot of South Carolina papers at the University of Michigan.
That was one of the places he went.
He's collecting all these papers, and putting together an edition is not as easy as people think.
No, it is not.
Been there, done that, having worked on the Lawrence papers.
And if I may just say, not only was it difficult, and Ben and Rick can definitely speak to that, Dave had a health scare in the middle of all this. So that momentum that drives, as you know, drives you to collect and transcribe and keep going fell short because Dave's health issues. But with Charles reinvigorating Dave, the two of them really set a plan forward on how it was going to happen, and that set the process going again. And then Charles handpicked both Ben and Rick to see the papers and work very closely with Dave Nealon on getting the final product done. Ben
or Rick, who wants to address that? Get the process going. To tell our listeners what all you were doing. I mean, Art, you're transcribing it. You're typing it into your computer. Let's go from there.
So actually, most of the transcription was already done by Dave. We checked those transcriptions against the original copies, but he did a very good job of transcribing the documents themselves. Mostly what Rick and I were doing is adding the historical context. So the footnotes, the biographies of the important characters, we were fact-checking and sort of putting everything in larger context, sort of doing the additional historical research work that surrounded the papers themselves in order to make them a digestible product for a reader.
Okay, a couple of things. Let's do the footnotes first. This is so somebody who is not an expert on the Revolution, if you mention Snow's Island, you identify what Snow's Island is, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Correct. So people, places, events happening around Marion that he's not personally involved with, but that have to be understood in order to understand the letters, things like that.
And I think it's important to mention at this point that the goal that Charles always had was to be born digitally. So when you have those footnotes, for the non-historian like me who thinks a flank is something on a grill and not a military movement, I can enjoy the papers, click on the footnote, and be taken to that larger context piece that hits me, and then I can come back. So the being born digitally really helps in those footnotes and those context pieces, and that's why Ben and Rick spent so much time on that. It was so incredibly important for the non-historians.
As an old historical editor, what did you do about spelling, dates?
We had 4 meetings that lasted 112 hours each. No, I'm kidding. But we struggled with that. Ben and Rick went back and forth.
Yeah, well, one of the unique things about that was you had to make sure that all the misspellings were misspelled correctly. Because we wanted those letters were portrayed exactly as they were.
Yeah, you didn't want to correct them because you would be altering the historical document.
Listen, exactly. Writing South Carolina history with spell check will drive you bananas.
I was going to say, we had multiple meetings about the spelling of Charleston, right? Whether to use the modern spelling or the 18th century spelling. And I actually changed every reference to the city of Charleston twice.
Exactly.
To the modern spelling and then back to the 18th century spelling.
Well, so did you use 2 words with an E or what?
So it's one word, but it has a W in it.
Okay.
Until the name is officially changed in 1783 to drop the W, at which point we start spelling it that way. Within the documents themselves, we had to make sure that we retained the original spelling, and that, sometimes we had to literally try and decipher the handwriting and make a judgment call. But then we also had to make decisions about how we were going to standardize those spellings in footnotes.
Not to mention punctuation.
Oh, that was my next question. Well, you mentioned handwriting. So Marion, he was educated, but not as formally as somebody like Henry Lawrence, who would have had a very elegant script. Is that right? Or
I personally thought Marion was rather easy to read compared to Rutledge.
I will say that Marion's handwriting was not that difficult, and of course he had a beautifully script. His Francis Marion autograph, if you will, was absolutely fantastic, and it shows up on about every document that you have.
Okay.
Some of the others were more difficult as you're trying to decipher their handwriting.
That's why it takes so many different eyes on a document.
And as Ben was saying, Dave Nealon did an unbelievably good job of transcribing these things. And there were very few things, very few that we had to change anything. But then again, your focus was more on making sure that the way the letter was written came out in the transcription, so that it was as accurate as possible to the historical example.
You want to give us an example?
Well, a lot of times, if we're talking just about the content of the letters, Marion was an extremely straightforward guy. He did not embellish. If we talk about the Battle of Blue Savannah, William Dobin James later described it as that Marion drew the British into an ambush and then drove them into the swamp, which was a tactic he used frequently throughout the war. Marion himself, in a letter to Gates, says, hit the initial camp, realized it was not the main camp. They met the British coming towards them on the march, and they attacked them directly. He doesn't talk about ambush. There's no flowery term. The only thing he does to kind of give a little bit of color to it, he says, and I drove them into a swamp only fit for Tories. And I have been to that swamp, the little PD swamp, their vicinity of that battlefield. The ground drops off about 16 feet into the swamp.
Oh, okay. So there might have been casualties with the local snakes and alligators as well.
That's very possible.
Always. Ben, what example would you say?
So I'm not sure this really fits what you're asking, but the letter that we always kept coming back to was, there's one after the Savannah expedition where he is writing to one of the officers who had been on leave and is returning to the army. And they had served in Savannah with the French for the first time. And Marion writes to him, all of the officers in the regiment now sport a handsome pair of mustachios. Is that the right term, Rick?
That's
Is that
exactly
the exact
right.
wording?
He commented on his mustachios.
Yeah, his pair of mustachios that all of the officers were wearing, and that if you have not one, you will be most singular. They met French people for the first time, and they all grew mustaches.
Well, Karen McNutt, who has written a wonderful battlefield guide of Georgetown for us for the SC-250 that will be coming out later, she actually did a portrait of Francis Marion with the mustache.
Yeah.
And I don't know that anyone has really ever seen that one.
Somehow, I just don't see Marion with a mustache. I really don't.
That's why these papers are so important. It's because it has really changed a lot of our perspectives on what we think Marion or who he was.
Well,
I got a question that's just kind of like very mundane, but how many papers, once you've gotten them all together, do you have a count?
how many letters?
How many letters?
What, Ben, it was close to 600?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it's somewhere in the vicinity of 600. It's being published in 3 volumes, and each of those volumes is around 300 pages with notes.
And, we need to mention, when you say published, this is digitally published. Let's tell folks where they can find that.
That is available on South Carolina 250th website, which is South Carolina spelled out 250.com, and also on the South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust has a link to it. And that's very important because it is free to the public. You can download it no matter if you're a historian, if you're working on someone else's papers, you're a graduate student, you are sitting in a car and just Googling it. Mm-hmm. You can download that, and it is free to the public. Because SC-250 is funded through the legislature, that's public money, and it needs to be available to the public. And that was incredibly important to us. So, and the beauty of that also is, and we can talk a little bit about this at any point in time, is that if we have edits, those can be done seamlessly. Mm-hmm. Or if new ideas come up about a portrait or another letter or something. Don't you think, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we are working right now, our publisher and I are working on adding some more maps to the first volume. So, we will be able to continue to add to this, including if another letter turns up. We can seamlessly integrate
that actually happened when we were right ready to press the button to publish. A colleague of ours said, "I think I have a letter you've never seen. I'm not real sure." Wow. And sure enough, and I don't think that it didn't go into the first volume. I think it's second or third volume letter. But those things happen.
Well, and in the old-fashioned print edition, once it's there, it's there. But when you were talking earlier about just the term flank and how you could have a footnote, if you were using a traditional printed footnote, it would have to be very small. I mean, you couldn't go into a lot of variation or elaboration. You just want to say whatever the British term was in one sentence. The fact that digitally it allows you to put a lot more information out there and enrich the product as well. It
was living and breathing. I can remember one meeting where Ben and Rick and Valley, our publisher, sat and talked, probably, no joke, for an hour about one particular footnote that ran into 2 pages. That if you had done that in a print version, how would you have really worked on that? And then would you lose the reader? And using the technology available today, we were able to solve that problem.
All right, Volume 1 is out.
Volume 1 is out.
And it covers what period?
1759 to 1780.
So this covers as part of the Cherokee campaign?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Which, again, that's highlighted in The Patriot, flashback.
And we should mention the Cherokee campaign was about when?
1759 to 1761.
It was
Is that
all,
right, Ben?
Yeah.
It was all part of the French and Indian War. The Brits called it the Great War for Empire. And South Carolina mounted 2 expeditions into the backcountry to deal with the Cherokee. And that's where Marion got his military experience. So did people like Isaac Huger who
So
became
did Sumter.
And Moultrie, who that's where their friendship begins.
Yeah.
It really is a training ground for the entire generation that would lead South Carolina in the Revolution.
And do you feel like, Ben, that context really plays into understanding 1781 and then beyond?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, Marion's background in irregular warfare comes from the Cherokee campaign and the work that he did as a junior officer in the Cherokee campaign. I mean, for most of the Revolution, Marion is a regular officer. That's something that we often forget. But until 1780, he was a field officer in the 2nd Continental Regiment. He was a regular Army officer. And to the extent that he had any experience with partisan warfare, that came from his earlier service in the Cherokee campaign.
I did a presentation for the General William Moultrie chapter of the SAR, and the topic was influences on Marion's rise to partisan command. And the Cherokee War was front and center on that. He learned what the regular army was doing, and he learned that piece of it. But he also saw how the regular army was treating the militia. Mm-hmm. And he learned that you could not treat militia the same way. Hey, they did not respond to discipline and the lash the way regular army did. So Marion learned that these folks, you had to do it differently. And so that was one of the valuable lessons he learned. And as a light infantry commander, when they were around the Congarese preparing to go forth on their Cherokee campaign, one of the things that folks don't realize is if you look at the roster, there pops up a detachment from Rogers Rangers who were there. And I firmly believe that Rogers Rangers, at least that detachment, gave some insight to Marion and his men.
You're talking about folks from New England?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this was a British expedition, so somehow these guys wound up down here, and you see that in the roster. And they don't mention them by name, but there are 4 or 5 of these folks. And so I am sure that, the same Ranger handbook that, from my military career, I wasn't a Ranger, but the Ranger handbook was great for all sorts of light infantry patrolling, all that sort of stuff. It gave you the rules. Rule number 1, don't forget nothing.
Exactly.
And I'm sure that those guys trained the light infantry, and Marion took that.
So his first letters deal with the Cherokee campaign. Any letter or incident stand out? Something in the back of my mind, he talked about when they started burning the villages, it upset him.
The cornfields.
Yeah, and Ben, you can chime in on this too. There weren't very many letters that Marion actually wrote from that time period.
No, there's very few until really his Continental service. So that is definitely the smallest piece of the historical record.
But it's the largest piece in setting who he was.
Oh, certainly.
Yeah,
and I think one of the things that really comes through in the Marion Papers is the way that Marion, more than anyone, serves as kind of this bridge between the regular army campaign in South Carolina and the partisan campaign, which, in the early part of the Southern War is really kind of, that relationship is kind of ad hoc. But Marion's close relationship with Nathaniel Greene and with, Henry Lee, who's kind of his counterpart from the regular army, really is vital in coordinating the efforts of these 2 very different parts of the American army. And I think that really draws on the diversity of his military experience, both in the Cherokee campaign and in the Continental Army.
Of course, it helped that Nathaniel Greene ended up being in command of the Southern Department. Benjamin Lincoln and Galloper Gates.
There's a bunch of eye rolling going on right now when Gates' name is mentioned.
Let's give his real name too.
General Horatio Gates.
Horatio Gates, the
hero of Saratoga.
Yeah, the hero of Saratoga. A couple of heroes at Saratoga, neither one of them probably being Gates.
Who galloped away from the Battle of Camden, right?
The real hero of Saratoga was Benedict Arnold.
Yes, he
actually,
was.
In terms of
and Daniel Morgan.
Yeah. Anyway, there are military historians who are trying to revive Gates's reputation in strategy and so forth, but I'm not buying any of it. I'm sorry.
What I fault him most for is that he did not get word to DeKalb that DeKalb was in command, that he was no longer on the battlefield. DeKalb had actually led the rear guard of a 50,000-man army in Europe during a battle. I think that DeKalb would have done a better job of trying to get his folks out of there and maybe save the army a little bit more intact.
Well, I'll throw another dart at Gates. Had he listened to our man about the best way to come south instead of following Thomas Sumter's directions through territory where there was no food, no forage, Marion said, go west and then come south. And Sumter said, oh, no, sir, go straight down there. And, of course, we know green corn, molasses, all of that basically made a lot of the troops literally unfit to fight when they got there.
Most accounts are that the men spent more time on the side of the road than on the road.
Well, you mentioned another favorite character of mine, Thomas Sumter. And as the non-historian of the group, I think Thomas Sumter sometimes gets a very bad rap. And I'm going to work on his reputation. And actually, that's another set of papers that are going to be coming out right on the heels of the Marion Papers. And those two groups have actually worked together. So Ben and Zach Lemhouse and Rick had to get together and really talk about those two personalities. And Ben and I were talking yesterday, and I said, I really feel like these Marion Papers changed that dynamic a lot on how Sumter and Marion thought of each other. They may not have personally liked each other, but there was a great respect for them. And Ben, would you concur with that, having worked on it, that things that we have thought or held fast to, such as, well, Marion just ignored his letter. Well, Ben has come to find out, and Rick, who's waving his hand at me, that maybe those letters really just passed in the night.
Literally, I will tell you, Dr. Edgar, you have probably heard the narrative around the Rounds campaign. This was right after Greene is going up into North Carolina, the race to the Dan, and he finally convinces Sumter to take action. Sumter goes to Fort Granby, which is across the river from the baseball stadium there at the University of South Carolina. And at Fort Granby, he writes the famous letter to Marion, in which he says, time is of the essence. I need you to distract Lord Rawdon so he won't come after us. I think we can achieve great things if we work together. And he sent that letter off. And all the historians, Hugh Rankin, Robert Bass, all these other folks, the narrative after that is Marion ignored him. Marion drug his feet. Marion sulked. Marion did not want to be under Sumter's command. Marion dispersed his troops so he would not have to fight under Sumter. Marion did not...
You never heard that from me.
No, not at all. But what happened here is that the letters that they did not have access to, they had to fill in the blanks a little bit because they did not have, primary source accounts for it. It took Sumter's letter 6 days to get to Marion. He wrote the letter the day he started the siege at Fort Granby. The letter's got to cross 2 rivers, go through bad guy territory to find a guy as elusive as the swamp fox. And it finally gets to him over near Indiantown, and he responded immediately. As a matter of fact, in his letter, he said that was the second letter from Sumter. You would send out multiple copies, hoping that at least one would get to whoever you're sending it to. And he said, hey, I've got your letter. I will collect my troops, and I will be at the headwaters of the Black River on February 29th. Well, it wasn't leap year. What he actually meant was March the 1st. Mm-hmm. On March the 1st, he is vicinity Salem Black River Church off of Highway 378.
Still there.
And it is. And he was exactly where he said he would be when he said he would be.
Well, over time, Marion, again, had no progeny, and Thomas Sumter did, down to my dear friend Thomas Sumter Tisdale, who recently passed away.
Who was working on our Sumter papers.
Yeah. So Sumter, first of all, was his own PR guy. And I'm sorry. I appreciate what Sumter did. He was a great recruiter. He was not a particularly astute tactician in the field. Come on, a commander get caught with his pants down literally twice. But I appreciate the role he did. He could mobilize. Obviously, you look at, and you've already mentioned Pickens, who had an on-again, off-again relationship. But at crucial times, those three men in disparate parts of the state, they made a difference. From my own military experience with partisan warfare and studying partisan warfare, Marion had it down right. So did Greene, from the Continental's point of view.
You also have to look at where Marion was conducting his operations. There was a Loyalist contingent up in what is now Horry County. You had Camden, you had Georgetown, you had the route that would take you from Charleston to Camden. You could cross at Nelson's Ferry and go up that way by Fort Watson. And you had Fort Watson, of course, was also occupied. Marion's guys sat in the middle of all that. And, there were times when Sumter would write to Greene and say, well, Marion, can't bring that many men out. And that was true. But one of the things is that I think Marion pretty much had kind of a standing order that come when you can, go home when you need to. Pretty much like in the movie The Patriot, where they see smoke and they go and the man finds his family killed there on his farmstead. Every time those men left their homes, they didn't know what they would find when they got back. Marion and his men, they were engaged throughout that time frame. And though we can track probably about 70 what I would call specific skirmishes, Great Savannah, Blue Savannah, all that kind of thing that you associate with Marion and his men, one of the things that we fail to realize is all the multiple patrols that they sent out. If there was about 70 what we call key actions, there were hundreds of other small engagements between 10 or 15 guys. And you sent out multiple folks that conduct an ambush somewhere on the trail there where the British are using to go to Camden or to Georgetown or coming out of Georgetown. And you look at all that, and if you sent out 5 patrols that are 15 or 20 men each, and they attack at dawn the next day, all of those folks had one name, and that was Marion. And the psychological effectiveness of that, where you have Tories sitting around the campfire in their camp looking in the darkness of the woods, waiting to see if it was going to erupt with musket fire, that happened multiple times. And we can't underestimate, and neither can we actually count when all those happened. Marion didn't write about every one of those things.
One of the things that people have described Marion's band, and it's why Gates and some other Continental officers were very derogatory, because they didn't have uniforms. They ranged from working class folks. It included free persons of color. Mm-hmm. Does Marion ever talk about the different people that are fighting with him?
I don't recall where he got into detail of specifics like that. Ben, do you remember anything specifically?
He's often very matter of fact, but yeah, we know a fair amount about the composition of Marion's fighting force, and yeah, it is all walks of life. It is free people of color. It is also slaves in some isolated incidents. Yeah, I mean, it is a very cosmopolitan bunch.
But he would not necessarily have thought it so remarkable that he would write about it in his letters, would he?
Well, Otho Holland Williams, who was deputy adjutant to first Baron DeKalb and then to Horatio Gates, Otho Holland Williams wrote about Marion arriving in North Carolina. This was after he had injured his ankle, and I paraphrase somewhat, that Colonel Marion of South Carolina arrived with a small band of men. They were men and boys, about 20 in number. They were black, they were white, they were old, they were young. Essentially, their clothing was terrible. Their weapons atrocious. The only good thing about them is they were all mounted, and that the regular troops, it was all the commanders could do to keep them from laughing out loud at them. In this letter, he says that the general sent him of his own volition away, so that they could do their business or whatever. Well, you look at that, and people have thought that was General Gates that sent Marion away. And that's part of the Gates narrative as well, anything that you can kind of throw at him. But anyway, in this case, it was actually Baron de Kalb who sent him away. And in a subsequent letter, I believe it's dated the 10th of July, Baron de Kalb is writing to General Richard Caswell, who commands the North Carolina militia, and he says that you should write and acquaint yourself with Colonel Marion, who have sent to Cole's Bridge to gather intelligence and supplies. So he sent him out on a mission, and I think that de Kalb had an influence on Marion, and his influences. One of the influences of Marion's rise to partisan command. Because I think, you can look at Parson Weems' book, which was, he kind of really took Peter Ory's memoir and romanticized it. And reading it carefully, sometimes you can pick out tidbits, I think, that are more factual. And one of the things is they talked about was that Marion and Ory had dinner with de Kalb, at least on one occasion, if not a couple of occasions, and de Kalb talked about commanding partisans in Europe. And I think that probably that conversation would have talked about partisan warfare and how mounted men in conducting operations, particularly in an area in South Carolina where, you had to have horses to get around, that had a definite influence on Marion, because Marion did that transition from being an outstanding regular commander with the 2nd South Carolina. And if you read through these letters, Lincoln, Moultrie, all these other folks relied on Marion significantly, particularly after the Battle of Savannah, as they were reorganizing the South Carolina Continentals. And so Marion had an outstanding reputation. He was a disciplinarian. And he then went into a position when he took command over at Witherspoon's Ferry, which is modern-day Johnsonville, South Carolina. I grew up 7 miles from there. That when you go there and you look at what Marion was able to accomplish, he had to do a transition himself from wanting to be that outstanding regular commander to commanding militia. And I totally, going through these letters now, understand his frustration. Having been an Army officer myself, he could not rely one day to the next on the number of troops he had. And he looked enviously at Light Horse Harry Lee's Legion, who fought along with him, because Lee had folks that were going to be there every day. They were outstandingly trained, uniformed, equipped, all that. And he was envious of Lee only because that type unit he could have done wonders with if he had had that opportunity. But he had it in militia. So I totally understand.
Guess what? No disrespect to Light Horse Harry Lee, but I think Francis Marion did a better job.
I don't disagree with that at all.
Probably because he saw he put his frustrations into an opportunity.
And one thing you mentioned that I think folks forget, and that is Marion's men were mounted.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, absolutely. What I understand about Marion's tactics, he had an outstanding intelligence network. And that outstanding intelligence network, if a convoy was leaving out of Georgetown or somebody coming out of Charleston, it was a matter of hours the word was getting to Marion. And Marion would be able to figure out where they were. I mean, these folks were regular Army, so they had a certain amount of distance that they would travel. So if they're here now, they should be there at this time. And Marion sometimes would have his men, ride, 60 miles in a night. They would put their horses and hide them back in the swamp. They would fight dismounted, then get on their horses and go and lay up during the daytime and ride back at home later that night.
Well, see, the topography of that part of the state today is different from what it was
absolutely.
in Francis Marion, because in those days, they were almost like an English forest, huge trees, and not much undergrowth. So it was basically open terrain. Yeah, there were swamps, but the area that was not swamp was not thickets and all of that kind of thing. It was quite a different world.
Ben, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just expanding on the topic of Marion's men being mounted and the mobility that they maintained. This is one of the few arguments that he has with Nathaniel Greene, and it shows up in the letters. Greene, at one point in 1781, tries to draft all of Marion's horses into Continental service to essentially dismount Marion's militia and appropriate their horses. And Marion basically tells him no, and they go back and forth, and eventually Greene backs down because it is so essential to the job that Marion was doing that his men remain mounted.
Yeah, Marion definitely fell on his sword over that one. And it was one of those things that Light Horse Harry Lee had sent a letter to Greene saying, "Oh, Marion's got horses he could give to you." This was right at the surrender of Fort Mott. And Marion said, as soon as this operation is over with, and I was thinking of resigning my commission anyway, or actually stepping back. He says, I would like permission to go to Philadelphia, at which point Greene came to him and they had a discussion, and that didn't happen. Would Marion actually have done that? I don't think so.
Mm-mm. All right. Well, folks, I hate to do this. Alfred's giving me the wind-up sign, just like he has been doing for over 25 years.
He's not that old.
He's not that old.
I'm exactly that old.
Well, Dr. Edgar, I will say that Volume 1 is out. Volume 2 will be incredibly interesting. It's focused on 1781 and Volume 3. And I think that you will see Marion's progression not only from a junior fighting officer to a partisan to a statesman as well.
Well, it's a great story, and SC 250 and the Battleground Trust helped make all of this possible. It's all recognition of South Carolina, the Southern Campaign, where you will have heard me say this on the radio and now on my podcast for over 2 decades, where the American Revolution was truly won.
Amen.
Absolutely.
So, Molly Fortune, Ben Rubin, and Rick Wise, thank you so much for being with us today on The Journal. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I know that I did. Francis Marion is a legendary figure not only in South Carolina history, but in American history and in the annals of military history. The significance of this project, including correspondence between Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter, helps us better understand the often complicated relationship between these two great partisan leaders.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
Many of the books discussed on Walter Edgar's Journal can be found as part of the Walter Edgar's Journal Book Nook section at All Good Books in Columbia, South Carolina, or may be available from your local bookstore. We'll talk again soon.